Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the correct time of day is where you are. Thank you for joining us today. If you've joined us before, you know I don't like to waste time before we get started. If it is your first time, welcome. I hope you like what you see. Before I hand things over to today's presenter, Lyndon White, I will start just with a brief introduction of the ICCP, who we are, and what we do. Okay, so who is the ICCP? We are a professional members organization that recognizes those with the skills, qualifications, and expertise in the professional management of construction claims. We have three primary objectives: to establish international professional standards for the management of claims, to give recognition to those who have achieved those standards, and to help and educate those who would like to gain the experience in claims management. Why is there the need for the ICCP when there are so many construction organizations? Quite simply, construction claims have become a key part of the international construction industry, and our members come from many backgrounds, from engineering, quantity surveying, project management, legal, etc., etc. And until the ICCP, there has been no institute that specifically recognizes those who have the specialist knowledge, experience, and skills to be able to manage, prepare, and respond to claims to the highest levels of professionalism. Okay, I'll just point out that we have an elected steering committee with 5 elected fellows, our elected president, and Andy Hewitt, our executive officer. In terms of membership, we have 3 levels of regular individual membership, which are based on a set of criteria. We have student membership, which can then be moved into graduate membership for those who are seeking an initial construction qualification. We also have corporate membership for organizations, companies who have departments or the entire company that specializes in construction claims. And what's in it for the members? We have a website with a member area that has a knowledge bank with a collection of white papers, research, and articles. We have practical templates which help our members save time and also ensure that their claims are made to the highest possible standard. We have regular CPD webinars such as this one. Attendance is free, but a certificate of attendance is a member benefit. We have the ICCP Academy, which are member-only, slightly more technical sessions. We also offer savings on books and training, such as publishing discounts with Wiley Blackwell and Routledge, as well as a discount with our training partner, Claims Class. We have a newsletter to keep our members up to date on the latest happenings in the industry. We offer industry exposure in the form of a public listing of members, as well as the usual benefits of certificates of membership and logos. We also have a private LinkedIn group where our members can discuss their contracts and claims questions. And we have the optional benefit of the Register of Claims Practitioners, and this is popular with our members who are consultants who would like to increase their online profile. I realize that was a whirlwind tour, so if you would like to know more, when you registered for this session, if you requested more, you will be receiving more information in the next few days. Otherwise, please visit our website, instituteccp.com, or email Paulina Ganeva at paulina.ganeva, at instituteccp.com. Okay, that was very quick, but let's get to the heart of today's session. I would like to introduce today's presenter, Lyndon White, who will be discussing Australian infrastructure. Hi, Lyndon.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for the introduction. And for those who have seen me present before, they're probably ready for a sleep. So Jen and I talked a little while ago about the fact that there hadn't been a specific presentation on Australia. And so we decided to make a few slides just to generally discuss the topic and get some discussion going. Next slide, thanks, Jen. So without being facetious, there's the agenda, but I did ask the question at the start to say, where is Australia? And we'll deal with that in a second. And Paulina just mentioned before we got onto the call that in either Austria or Australia, there is a counter of some description that says, make sure that you're in the right country. Not too much in the spelling difference there. So we'll talk a little bit about where Australia is, the Australian states and territories, the Australian building and construction market in a statistical sense, how planning and budgeting for project works ordinarily occurs in Australia, which is probably not that much different to anywhere else in the world, and some things about if you're interested in doing business in Australia, because I think the ICCP membership is predominantly outside of the region, and some members and their companies may either be interested in or already work in Australia. Next slide, thanks, Jen. So we're fortunate enough to be located down in the Southern Hemisphere and then sort of off to the side of everyone else with a whole heap of water around us, which is great if you like the beach. It does cause some problems for us in relation to consistency between other countries. And that might range from technical standards all the way through to language and currency. But it does have its benefits as well, which it has an abundance of natural resources that are useful for construction and infrastructure projects. You can see generally on the map there that we're a long way from, let's say, the Eurocentric membership of the ICCP, but that doesn't mean that we're not in contact with them or they're not in contact with what goes on in Australia. Next slide, thanks, Jen. Just a little bit about the way that Australia is structured as far as its states and territories. So different to the European end of the world, where you have your Schengen Convention where people can move around freely and visas are issued in a particular way. Australia has a fairly simple approach in that it has political borders as opposed to geographical borders, and that is different to some of the other countries. But then some of those political borders sort of straddle geographical events like mountain ranges, like deposits of raw materials that can have an influence on the way that infrastructure projects occur. The political borders themselves have a huge influence on the way that infrastructure projects may occur between states and territories, and we can talk about that in a second. But the point I wanted to make on this particular slide is that even though just to the right of the slide there that there's 3 Australias, with the federal parliament being that composite parliament for Australia that makes law and governs Australia, that it is still only a federation of states. So it's the state and territory parliaments that have a substantial amount of power and the way that they plan for, the way they do infrastructure works. In the third depiction of Australia there with lots of dots on it, that's a total number of Australian councils, which are a third level of government in Australia. So on the one hand, there's an essence of bureaucracy, if you like, because we have 3 layers of government. On the other hand, that's the type of structure that we need at this point in order for things to work when we're working together between the states and territories and also within the states and territories.
Cool. Can you see the results?
Yeah. Okay. And that's I suppose goes back generally to the part of my opening approach, which is that the ICCP itself is centric to the Northern Hemisphere and mostly and also from the European end. But that's also the reason for having the session. So if we just think about the previous slide with the way that the government is structured, if we then move on to the next slide, for those who haven't done business in Australia before, there's some general information about the building and construction market. So when we think about those 3 pictures of the Commonwealth and the states, territories, and then the local councils, the numbers that I'm just presenting here are a composite. They're not just specific to any one particular state or territory. So the data available from the Australian Bureau of Statistics says that it's around about 250 billion Australian dollars every year that's spent on building and construction work, sort of circa 162 billion US. and around about 10% of our GDP, and that the building and construction work itself is about the 5th largest sector within the overall economy. There is an entity called Infrastructure Australia, and they're not the controllers of infrastructure, but they are somehow empowered to plan for, report on, and give some stewardship on infrastructure projects within Australia. And in February 21, they released a priority list. And then they also strategically audit the way that things carry on from there after the priority list starts to roll out. But the point I wanted to make in there is that that priority infrastructure list, amongst other things, includes these 5 items, sorry, as being the infrastructure projects that we have the highest priority. So for ICCP members working in the different countries that they do, it's probably not too dissimilar in that sense. The only one that might be a little bit different for Australia is the coastal inundation protection. That one surprised me when I was going through the priority list. Not to say that it shouldn't be in there, but it was actually higher in the rankings than I thought that it would have been given credit for. And I think also for the people that want a copy of this presentation, which they can get off the Institute, I've made sure that I've put links there so that if you need to go back and have a look at where the source of the information is that's available to you. Next slide. Thanks, Jen. So there's so many statistics, like so many different countries, and you can make the statistics say whatever it is that you want it to say in a sense. But I thought with this particular set of statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, just to look at the value of work done. So in the quarter, for last quarter of 2023, it actually rose by 4.1%. And because I didn't want to fill up the slides with just endless data, in the quarter prior to that, it fell by 1.7%. So we do get a little bit of shift within the quarters, within the year. But overall, we can see here what's happened in the next couple of slides when we get to them, about how things generally level out. The seasonally adjusted work for the private sector actually rose 2% as well, which is also encouraging. But the value of work commenced fell 2.7%. So in a statistician's mind, I suppose that would mean a lot of things to us. But in the infrastructure world, what we're looking at there is, well, even though the work done is happening, the work that should have commenced, or was due for commencement, didn't, and maybe it comes in for the first quarter of 2024. We don't know until we see the data, of course. The little table that's there just gives a reference year of 21-22 for doing the chain volume measures, and then also for those overall values that we can see there, they generally align with the previous slide in relation to what's the total value of the work done over an annual period. Thanks, Jen. This slide didn't work out as well as I'd planned. I thought it might have been a little bit easier to see. However, I think from what we can see on the two charts on the right-hand side is between September 15 and December 23, is that over that 8-year period, we've gone through a bit of a slump. We've come back up in relation to the value of work done and commenced, and then gone back down again, and for the obligatory COVID lockdown period as well. Although construction infrastructure works weren't necessarily stopped in Australia during the COVID lockdowns, they were affected by it. And then what we can also see from the charts is, post December 21, is that things are gradually climbing again, as opposed to what we saw in the quarter prior to December 17, where there was a very sharp spike in the value of work done and commenced. Thanks, Jen. Well, the figures there look great. At least everyone that's on the call is in a fairly buoyant environment. And I suppose that's the point that we're making here in this particular presentation, is that Australia's got its own unique set of circumstances, but it's not the only country in the world that's committed to infrastructure, and particularly with the infrastructure priority list like we talked about earlier on. Next slide. Thanks, Jen. So generally for the planning and budgeting of works, from a government perspective, it's the state and territory parliaments that do a lot of publicly funded building construction works separately to others. That might sound a little bit convoluted, but they receive federal funding. The federal government can call for works to occur and award contracts, like big projects like a hydroelectric system. But on the other hand, the Australian states and territories plan for their own works, budget for it, and they may call on the federal to fund them along the way. When there's government funding involved, it can be, well, often it is, a lot different than where there's private funding involved, because there may be requirements there, such as having an accreditation with the Federal Safety Commissioner, even though it's a state project or a territory project. If there's federal money coming into it, there's still obligations back to the Commonwealth. There might be some other obligations in there as well about employing regional local content, local supply, local goods. And in 2013, for example, there was the Jobs Act that was brought through by the Commonwealth Parliament that was effectively saying, please employ Australian citizens before you employ expatriate people. Privately funded building and construction works must also be compliant with federal and the relevant state or territory laws and requirements. And the reason I raise that is that it's fine for someone to go out and build a new power plant or set up a new mine or whatever it is that they want to do and get their infrastructure set up for that. However, that doesn't mean that it's just because they're paying for it themselves that they can somehow sidestep any of the requirements that the governments might lay down in those particular jurisdictions. So for ICCP members, I think there's some similarities between the Australian infrastructure market and wherever they may work around the world. And so some of the content of this slide, it sort of goes to that. So, some of the established contractors in Australia include some of those that are already working in, Europe or South Pacific or Southeast Asia or the Middle East. And of course, then there's some different ones. And the link that I have there on that slide goes to a much longer list. But the point, I suppose, is there's not a huge quantity of contractors in the tier one market all of the time, because it comes back down to the infrastructure priorities and how the funding is actually being committed for that. Conversely, in an Australian only sense, of the 2 million companies in Australia, only 2,000 of them are listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So that if there were statistics available that were correct for the building and construction market, you would find that it's not necessarily the tier one contractors that control everything. They certainly have a huge influence, but there might be some level of control and influence from tier two or maybe even tier three contractors, and then specialist subcontractors and specialist providers. So quite an interesting place in which to work, which back to the purpose of the Institute about trying to keep things organised in a manner where claims are made on time, notified on time, claimed on time, and also done to a level where they can be understood and then assessed by the recipient. Then it makes sense that the market that they're working in understands what it is like the ICCP would do. So ICCP members that plan on working in Australia probably just have a little bit of homework to do on how those tiers of contractors fit in with each other. Some of the other things that you might need to consider if you're coming to Australia to do business are laid out just there, and they're in PwC had listed an interesting little guide on doing business in Australia. In fact, I think they do it for multiple countries around the world. But company and business structures in Australia are more than likely different setups to the way that you might have it in another jurisdiction, as are the visa and immigration requirements that might be held at the Commonwealth level as opposed to a state or territory level. Corporate and personal taxes are a huge influence there, and repatriation of profits might be an issue for those who are considering not being paid in Australian dollars in their own jurisdiction, for example. Australia has some fairly solid legislation in relation to payment times reporting. And we also have some fairly stiff consumer protection laws, which on the one hand, you'd look at for infrastructure projects and say, oh, well, maybe it won't be affected, but they won't affect the way that those works occur. But subcontractors, specialists, providers, and even general contractors that might be at the tier 1 level still have the ability to be protected by those laws. There's a couple of other pieces of legislation that are probably interest to the members as well. There's a Civil Dispute Resolution Act, which Section 4 goes along the lines of, before you get into any type of litigation arrangements, try and sort things out yourselves. And then there's a security of payment legislation with noticeable differences between each state and territory where it exists in every mainland jurisdiction and also Tasmania. And you can find out more information at that link, but the point being is that even though your contract might have specific provisions in relation to payment, the security of payment legislation cannot be contracted out of. So there's some interesting parts to navigate there. Finally, but no means the least, an important point here is that Australia is a signatory to the New York Convention on the Enforcement of International Foreign Arbitral Awards, and also the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And every state and territory of Australia has its own approach to anti-bribery, anti-corruption, and have their own commissions or other investigative tribunals that work in that area. Thanks, Jen, or Paulina. Thanks, Jen. So seems like a third of everyone on the call is still hesitant about Australia, which is okay. I know it can be a dangerous place. And that's generally the end of the slides, and we can move into a few questions. But the purpose of the presentation was just as an introduction to the Australian infrastructure market, and by no means anything exhaustive. So happy to take any questions there.
All right, thank you, Lyndon. So if anyone has a question, please pop it into the Q&A box. You should see it at the bottom of your screen. It's 2 text bubbles. Maybe you explained everything with such clarity that everyone's questions were answered. And oh, Jafar has raised his hand. Let me give him, Jafar, I'm going to give you permission to speak. Yeah, so please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Lyndon. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now, you have elaborated details for those organizations or companies to take part in infrastructure development of Australia. What is your take on for individuals, experts, specialists in the industry? How can they contribute to the development of infrastructure for Australia? Those who may have work rights.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of really good websites that actually promote, the immigration of qualified people in particular areas. So I think Engineers Australia, for example, has a bit of a campaign going, or they had one a little while ago I'm aware of. And but yeah, there's a lot happening in Australia. And one thing I didn't touch on in the slides, because it's its own topic, is that Brisbane has the Olympics in 2032, and I went to a session with the Dispute Resolution Board Federation a year or so ago, where the statement was made that if Brisbane is to get ready for the infrastructure for the Olympic Games in time, they should have started 7 years ago. So that's the sort of demand that we have on in the infrastructure end of the world, just in one state. But I do think that there was then a bit of a reduction in some of that areas when the Victorian government in the southern part of Australia pulled away from the Commonwealth Games last year. So there may be a little bit of capacity relief in that area. But yeah, definitely check out some of the discipline websites, if you like, and the institute websites, because they'll probably have a bit of information about what campaigns are being run.
If you'd rather, you could just send them to me after the presentation, and I'll make sure that those go out to everyone. That might be easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. We've got a few questions rolling in. Oh, sorry. Jafar, was that the end of your question? I didn't want to cut you off if you weren't finished.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. All right. Peter has the next question. He says, "Hi, Lyndon. What about Chinese contractors in the Australian market?"
Yeah, g'day, Peter. Long time since we've spoken. Lucky for you. Interestingly, some of the contractor names that I had up on one of the slides there are predominantly owned by Chinese consortia. And so the Chinese contractor presence in Australia has been long-standing in that sense, but different in the way that you and I would have experienced in other jurisdictions over the years, in that they've either bought established contractors of some description, or not necessarily had the same level of influence in the sense of the type of equipment or engineering disciplines that they might ordinarily use in other nations. And to that point, I think what Australia needs is probably more input from overseas contractors in order to help things progress. But at the same time, we're fairly rigid on the way that we apply our standards as well. Hopefully that's helpful, Peter.
Okay, thank you. I'll just move it right along because we do have a few questions rolling in pretty quickly now. Mohammed asks, what is the difference between Middle East infrastructure market and the Australian infrastructure market?
Well, I think there's a huge difference there, just in size, and obviously it'd be a completely different set of data that we'd be looking at there. But I think probably the main difference, if there is one to be talked about, is the difference in law. Australia is a common law jurisdiction, and whereas the Middle East has its own legal regime that is substantially different to Australia. Neither necessarily being bad or good or anything, but the point there, I suppose, Mohammed, is that in Australia, the way that we operate is that it's an adversarial system, whereas yours is more of or the Middle East is more of an inquisitorial system. So I think the money flows are probably substantially different in the Middle East to the Australian, and also the investment by other than government in projects is probably on another scale altogether from Australia.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next question is anonymous. It says, how do you think the Unfair Contract Terms Act will change the management of construction contracts in Australia?
Well, hopefully there is some change in that sense. And I'm not talking about, just the bigger contractor treating a smaller contractor poorly, but more in the way that people actually deal with each other in forming their contracts. So I think the legislation, and it's about time that things started to level out a bit in this area, has to be a little bit more practical than what was in place in the 1980s and the 1990s with state and territory legislation that sort of went some way to saying, oh, well, if there's bad provisions, here's the remedy for it. I think something like a piece of legislation that says these types of unfair contract terms will always be struck down doesn't give anyone the opportunity to sit there and sort of slumber on their rights, but it does give them the opportunity to go and negotiate on a different level with their other parties so that they can say, yes, we're not going to try and bind you up to something that's ridiculous. And if we do, well, I mean, we're all stupid for even going that way. That's my general thought about it, because, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of litigation that follows in the next few years when people actually test out what is, the true essence of fairness. but I think we're making some right steps, and some recent changes in legislation around Australia will help us along.
The next question is from Alessandro. According to you, what's the most challenging aspect of working in construction in the Australian market? And what are the most significant peculiarities when compared to the EU and the Middle East?
Okay, cool. Thanks, Alessandro. In the relation to the first part of the question, I think for the last few years, it's been related to supply chain for a lot of our imported materials. And even small things like bollards for construction works, or diesel because it's no longer made in Australia, if you like, or bitumen's no longer produced in Australia, they're imported from overseas. There's sort of really difficult circumstances around that, mostly to do with the way that the materials come into the country are then handled, stored, preserved, and then ultimately used. But then there's a corresponding cash flow aspect to that as well, which is if we do have those difficult parts of supply chain affecting us from other nations, how is it that we keep our jobs going? And then in relation to the second part of your question, what's peculiar about Australia and compared to the EU and the Middle East? Well, I'll pick on the Middle East first. I think probably the most peculiar thing in Australia compared to the Middle East would be the lack of unique construction equipment. So if I just pick on tunnel boring machines, for example, Middle East and Europe, for example, have plenty of access to everything that might be available. In Australia, if we're going to do a tunnel, and I'm just thinking back to one of the tunnels that was built in Queensland 14 years ago, where the tunnel boring machine was, of course, built for that particular tunnel itself, but then buried in the ground after it. So we actually had to invest in something that would never be utilised ever again. In relation to the EU, I think our probably the isolation part to where our resources are, even within Australia, that sometimes you can be, within maybe a couple of 100 kilometres of raw materials like gravels or crushed materials. But the transport cost is so expensive because there might be a mountain range in between it, and there's no, say, rail system or other transport via sea that might be able to take those raw materials at a competitive rate. Conversely, if you're comparing something in the EU where there might be a project in Portugal where Spain is providing some raw materials, there might be some economy to go by sea or by rail. I'm not so sure about the Middle East in that respect. I can't recall what the infrastructure is like between all of the nations there. But in relation to Australia, there's still problematic parts of rail in Australia where states and territories may not be aligned with each other on the way that materials are carted by rail.
The next question is from Dhruva, from Kathmandu, Nepal. Wow. Okay. Lots of people from developing countries migrate to Australia for the sake of employment, primarily in engineering construction. Would you please share your experience? How are the potentials in this sector?
Yep, thanks for that. And I think we touched on a little bit before with Jaffa's question as well, is yes, there's a lot of work that's occurring and skilled people are required. And I think what I'll do is when I look up a couple of different websites to send it off to Jen, that might be helpful as well. But I think there's always potential there, and particularly for people who are interested in and good at engineering and construction. But with the most recent shifts to the energy transition, or during the energy transition, there might be a different set of skills that are required that we might have been used to before. And yeah, I do think there's a lot of potential.
All right, thank you. And I just made a note to myself. I will add in a link with Lyndon's links. I have been receiving some notifications on LinkedIn about some upcoming changes in the visas for Australia. So they're probably just changing their point system a bit with engineering.
Oh.
It's done on a regular basis. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll just add the links that I've had dropping in my inbox lately. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, I'm ignorant to that as well because I live here. So.
Yeah. You don't have to apply for the visas. Yeah.
No.
All right. Next question is a word on the Australia-specific ADR mechanisms. So I think he's just asking, what are the popular alternative dispute resolution mechanisms currently in Australia?
Well, we've got everything available to us, Abhinav, but I think it'd be fair to say that the amount of litigation that's still going on says that ADR is still growing. Mediation is considered to be, an effective use of ADR in Australia, but not used as much as it should be, in particular in engineering construction disputes. The statutory adjudication under the Security of Payments Acts is very prolific around the states and territories, and that's worked well in the sense that it gets people into a rigor of, if they're going to get into some sort of disagreement on things, then they do have to get their paperwork tidied up. Similarly, too, that if one is going to threaten the other with a security of payment claim or some other action within there, that there's sometimes a greater likelihood that parties will actually talk about things and go to a softer settlement approach. I'm not saying that mediation's soft, but something like mediation where they can keep things private and confidential. Some states and territories actually publish the security of payments decisions or the adjudication decisions, so you can trawl through them and see who the people are that are most active. Other states and territories keep that very close to their chest. In relation to arbitration, certainly in the last 30 years, arbitration has been considered as being a primary or a premium mechanism for avoidance of court. But in many cases, parties either avoid it for whatever the reasons are, or if they do use it, it may not be, it's just purely in a domestic sense and not as much of the international arbitration that you may see in other jurisdictions. And then there is some expert determination that occurs around the place as well, and early mutual evaluation, and not necessarily just confined to engineering and construction. I can't recall if I've missed any of the disciplines there, and hopefully I haven't, but generally speaking, ADR in Australia is recognised and continues to grow.
All right, thank you. The next question is actually for me. Para has asked if there are any mutual agreements between the ICCP and AIQS. The ICCP currently does not have any mutual agreements, but I am making a note of that to be discussed with the steering committee. So that is something that the steering committee would have to discuss, and probably our president, Paul Gibbons, and executive officer, Andy Hewitt, would have to do the work on the back end of organizing all of those. So that has gone on a to-do list for me, and any further developments will be, of course, sent out to the membership. Okay, next question. Are foreign companies planning to operate in Australia mandated to have Australians as part of the ownership? If so, what percentage of shareholding?
I don't recall any specific requirement on that, but there's the Corporations Act for Australia that you could probably find the answer in, or maybe look at the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. There are all sorts of different entities that are covered under the Corporations Act, but I don't recall a mandatory percentage of shareholding by an Australian person or an Australian corporation.
Is there a substantial representation from either gender in this sector? So is there, I'm guessing, asking about female representation, because I'm sure there's plenty of men in construction.
Yeah. Certainly in the last more than a decade, there's been a big shift. And if you're interested in a bit more information on that, look up someone called Alison Mirams, M-I-R-A-M-S, and Alison was the the CEO for Robertson Co, which is a large building company in Australia. And Alison's recently shifted to the board, I think. But her thrust has been for a whole of her working career is to, improve gender representation throughout the sector, and also has a very passionate approach to working less days per week than more. But yeah, I think there's probably some statistics available on the Commonwealth Government website in that respect, if you're interested.
All right, thank you very much. And the last question we have in the box, are DRBs being used effectively in Australia?
I don't think so. I'd really like to see it happen that way. But yeah, for sure. I think in the areas that they have been used and are being used, they're probably working very well, but they seem to be a lot under the radar. And I remember going to a session with the DRBF in 2020, where there was some discussion about how do they become a bit more prolific and sort of self-starting. And I think it's just a matter of time, Chris, before people start to realise that a DRB is way better than, and particularly at the start of the project rather than some part of the way through where you can't agree on even appointing a DRB. I think that'll be a big shift for us in the mindset of construction and engineering. How
is the intervention of the court in the arbitral proceedings?
In that respect, I'd have a look at the International Arbitration Act of 1974, which is a Commonwealth piece of legislation in Australia. The short version is that because Australia is a signatory to the 1958 Convention, that any arbitral award, foreign or domestic, in that sense, and I'm assuming that you're talking about international, is then enforceable by a court. But intervention by a court, I think they'd be very unlikely to attempt to intervene unless there was some, outwardly looking approach to fraud, misconduct, lack of reasons, something else that might ordinarily disturb an arbitral award.
Why do you think FIDIC and NEC4 are so little used and it's mostly bespoke contracts being drafted?
Good question, David. And I ask myself this question all the time, and I'm working on a project now where standard forms were presented and and the parties decided that they would go bespoke, and that's fine, that's their choice. But my concern there is that, yes, you're using something that, even though you might be using words that are somehow similar or sometimes identical in the bespoke agreements, they're certainly not as effective as something that's a standard form like a FIDIC and NEC4. But I do think there is a little bit of groundswell that's building in this respect. And I think 29th of May this year that the Contracts Users Conference for FIDIC in Singapore will be presenting on some Australian aspects as well. But I also generally think that there's probably not enough information available there. And if there is available information for people to go and find it, it's the classic Australian thing where they think they're so good at drafting everything from scratch that, why let someone else tell them what to do?
All right, great, thank you. And that very closely relates to a question that was received by email in advance, which was, are you seeing the use of NEC contracts being used in large government or infrastructure projects?
Yeah, and in fact, it has been on the rise. And it's not just law firms, but I'll just mention law firms for a second here, because law firms have their own precedents. And on another recent project, my suggestion was to use FIDIC White Book for a consultant agreement. There is an Australian standard, of course, for that, but it's a lot, I wouldn't say out of date, but it's a lot older than the FIDIC White Book. And yet the law firm that was involved from the client side was very insistent on using their own precedent. And when you opened it up, it was actually a mixture of the White Book, the Australian Standard 4122, and some other standard forms from other jurisdictions, which I just thought that will probably get a lot of people into trouble.
The last question, are there any bottlenecks for foreign contractors to work in Australia?
At times I think there are, and I'm not thinking in the sense of that there's a prohibition on them, but there's bottlenecks in the sense of if the contractor is setting up for their first project in Australia and they haven't operated here for a substantial period of time, that they may run into bottlenecks in relation to, you know, registering for GST, for example, or having a builder's license. For example, in Queensland, if you don't have a builder's license for building work, then there's specific legislation that says how much you can get paid. It's cost plus, I think, maybe 10%, which some contractors would probably say that's a great percentage to get paid on top of their cost. But not having the license then, you know, carries an obligatory fine with it as well. But as far as bottlenecks in the sense of, you know, is Australia trying to prevent foreign contractors to come in and take the jobs of Australian contractors? I don't think there's anything that's outwardly presented in that respect. But yeah, a little bit more research in that area might pull up something different.
All right, thank you very much. We had a little bit of a fire scattergun approach there of quick fire questions for you, but you gave some great answers, so thank you very much. And we have emptied out our Q&A box. So thank you very much. Is there anywhere that you would like people to find you?
Well, the ones that know me know exactly where to find me. It'll be at the beach. Or giving someone a sermon on why they should use ADR more. But otherwise, just find me on LinkedIn. I don't have a website, and there's a specific reason for that. But yeah, anyone that wants to get in touch with me, if they can't find me generally out there, I'm sure Jen or Paulina might be able to point in my direction.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. We have had a few thank yous coming in from attendees, and a thank you for covering lots of questions. And thank you to all of the attendees for showing up and having some great questions. Oh, one more popped in. Let's see. Oh, another thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me along, and thanks to everyone for attending and listening to.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.